In a Scotland Tonight special, rights for trans people. Should laws be changed to make it easier for them to legally change their sex? Or would reforms to Scotland's Gender Act threaten women's rights? Feminists, trans women and politicians debate the issues. The Scottish Government is committed to reviewing and reforming gender recognition law and last year consulted on it. As yet, they've not put forward their proposed changes and there's rifts within the SNP over the issue. So what is the content of the current Gender Recognition Act? Individuals can obtain a gender recognition certificate if they are over 18 and can prove to a panel that they've been diagnosed with gender dysphoria, that they have lived as their chosen gender identity for at least 2 years, and that they commit to live as their acquired gender for life. Trans rights campaigners broadly agree the legislation should be reformed so people aged 16 and over can change their gender identity and self-declare their chosen gender identity without the intrusion of medical diagnosis or having to prove that they've lived as their chosen gender for 2 or more years. Well, our political correspondent Ewan Petrie has been speaking to those campaigning for and against reform.
Until all of us are safe, none of us are safe.
It's a bit humiliating to kind of have to go through a legal process, to have to go through a medical process, just to have recognised something that you know to be true and just to have recognised a life that you're already living.
For some, the current laws on gender recognition are a source of distress, discomfort and frustration. These proposed reforms, they say, would help make their lives easier.
Making it less expensive, making it less rigorous, and most crucially, taking away gatekeeping from medical institutions so that you no longer have to have a psychiatric process in order to amend the gender on your birth certificate, but just be able to declare it yourself, just to be able to go through that process yourself. And it's really quite a minor legal reform.
This group is protesting against the visit of Meghan Murphy, a feminist who says she's been banned from Twitter after commenting on the issue.
I believe that women's rights and spaces should be protected.
The Canadians' concerns are shared by some women's groups here.
Women's rights stand to be rolled back if sex is replaced in law by gender. We see a lot of councils now asking for gender data rather than sex data, and sex, of course, is the protected characteristic under the Equality Act, but we're seeing that people are finding it increasingly difficult to enforce that, and councils, public bodies, governments are not defining that.
Trans women have been using single-sex services for 2 decades in this country without incident, without serious problem.
Becky transitioned after moving to Scotland almost 10 years ago.
Bad behaviour in a changing room, somebody being an exhibitionist in a changing room, is a crime, and it would still be a crime, and it's not changing that. And I am adamantly for people behaving badly being sanctioned for bad behavior. You don't take rights away from an entire group because of the bad behavior of a small minority.
Some public authorities, such as the Prison Service, have adopted policies on trans inclusion while these proposals are being considered.
When I looked at the equality impact assessment carried out by the Prison Service, it didn't take account of the impact of the policy on female prisoners and female prison officers. So, for example, what you've seen in Scotland and elsewhere in the UK is that trans women, so men who identify as women who are in the prison estate, have, not all, but some have been moved to the female prison estate. Now, that's not to say that they are all potential predators on those women, but for example, most women in prison have been the victims of male violence themselves. Many will suffer from PTSD, so the idea that you might put a male-bodied person in their midst is quite troubling, really.
The Scottish Government remains committed to reforming gender recognition law. But this is a debate that has become polarised, at times abusive. Addressing the concerns raised while ensuring equality will require a significant change in tone.
And let's turn to the debate. We brought together 2 politicians, Joan McAlpine and Maggie Chapman, to discuss the issue. Maggie, first of all, why do you think the Gender Recognition Act needs to be reformed?
I think there are a few things within the way things currently work that we need to change. Firstly, in order to self-certify, in order to get a gender reassignment certificate, it's a lengthy process. Individuals need to go through medical or psychological examinations. They need to have lived in the gender that they want to live as for 2 years. And that creates a whole host of issues around potential dangers coming out during those 2 years. What happens in those 2 years, that they could be made to be very vulnerable during that period. But also there's the cost of it. It's £140 to get the certificate, but there's the medical and psychological assessments as well that people often have to pay for themselves.
Joan, don't you think that this vulnerable minority needs protecting? I mean, what are your concerns about these possible reforms?
Yes, I think this is a vulnerable minority in the sense that people who have gender dysphoria are vulnerable, and that's why I think the current process is right, that you need a medical diagnosis. And I wouldn't have any problem with not having charges for the medical diagnosis, because if it's a medical condition, you shouldn't be charged for it. My issue is that the proposal is to allow any male to simply declare himself female, which allows you to change the sex on your birth certificate, and access female single-sex services, and that means that other vulnerable people, like disabled women, elderly women, vulnerable girls, cannot demand a single-sex service, and that's one of the problems, that any man can identify this way, and there's no checks or balances, there's no gatekeeping. So it would mean that, and we're seeing it already, that someone who's a sex offender, that men commit 97% of sex offences. They can simply change the sex in their birth certificate, wipe out their whole history, change their identity and present as a woman, and that can't be right.
Maggie, you come back in that.
Well, a few things on that, Joan. I think, firstly, the people responsible for abuse are abusers, regardless of their gender identity, regardless of anything else. If there is criminality, that's down to those individuals. And I think, you know, a lot of services, whether they are shelters, domestic abuse services, they are already run and have been for many years, run very effectively on people's self-identification, not having to present birth certificates. So we know, we have evidence from Engender, from Scottish Rape Crisis, from a whole host of different women's services, that trans women have been accessing these services and have gained the support that they desperately need from these services, which is absolutely right, and absolutely as it should be.
Trans women have been using these spaces for quite some years.
That is the norm.
So I've got hundreds of messages from women who have accessed these services, or who are running these services on the ground, who have deep concerns about this, because this isn't actually about transgender people. The current law defines transgender people. The proposals mean that you can't define transgender people because anyone can declare themselves transgender.
And if you
hang on one second.
Yeah. So it therefore means that any man, no matter what his background is, can declare himself to be a woman and access women's services. And what's happening at the moment is that, yes, it's quite right that the Equality Act actually protects single-sex services, so you can exclude men who identify as women, but that's not happening because self-identification is already being put in place. So you've got the ridiculous situation where Glasgow Life, which runs the leisure centres in Glasgow, says that transvestites, not transgender people, but transvestites can access women's services. It's fraught with difficulties. You can protect the vulnerable minority without opening things up.
Maggie, can you accept that there are concerns from women about these same-sex spaces?
There may be concerns, but I mean, Joan, you've said that you accept gender dysphoria exists. So if we're saying gender dysphoria exists, it means that we know that these people are vulnerable. We know that trans people face abuse, face bullying, face harassment, face a whole range. Can I finish, please?
Absolutely, but let's also put this point to you that, you know, the fact that Rape Crisis, Scottish Women's Aid, zero tolerance groups, they're all in favour of these reforms. Joan, is that? And they have had women's interests and heart for many years.
Well, all I can say is I can repeat many women, including women who manage these services, perhaps not at the top, have got serious concerns about them. And obviously they've been told that they have to be trans-inclusive in order to provide the service, in order to get their funding. I don't think it's up to women like me or Maggie or the women who run these organisations at a senior level to tell other women what their boundaries should be. It's not just, excuse me, it's not just about safety, it's about privacy and dignity of women. And my elderly mother should be able to demand a single-sex service. My severely disabled sister should be able to demand a single-sex service. This is about very vulnerable women, and it's about boundaries around privacy. It's not just about safety. Some of these men they're not making any meaningful transition.
Boundaries about privacy for... Well, actually, there's been a lot in, and I've not been able to come back on the points that I wanted to. Firstly, I think you talked about fraudulent claims. We know that if people self-identify in a fraudulent way, that's criminal behaviour. We know that's enshrined, and that can be prosecuted as criminal behaviour. We know that. Secondly, we know that in the same way as homosexual people faced bullying, abuse, and that kind, a whole range of really unpleasant behaviour and dangerous behaviour. All of these arguments, it's exactly the same arguments coming. What it comes down to, Joan, is hegemony. We live in a patriarchal society that says there are two genders. Now, you and I both know that that's not the case.
It seems very difficult to have a discussion about this without, you know, emotions really running high. And we've seen this on social media, that it is becoming quite hostile. And, you know, perhaps you've both had abuse. I mean, why is this so difficult to have such a rational discussion about? And why is this becoming so kind of explosive on social media, do you think?
Well, I think there's a lot of misinformation. There's, you know, if you read any of the briefings by any of the women's organisations and other organisations that work in this area, they know that there's a lot of misinformation out there. But I think that there's something really quite important to consider here. In the same way as over the last 20, 30, 40 years, we know that homosexuality has been treated in a way that has led to the targeting and the marginalisation of gay people. Some of the exact same arguments. Sorry, there's an important point here. Joan, you said about abusers turning up to women's centres. Women's centres have ways of dealing with lesbian abusers who turn up to their centres. Exactly the same systems will be in place.
Let's come back to the point about social media. I mean, do you feel that you're being shut down when you go on to talk about it?
Can I just say 97% of sex offences are committed by men, possibly more than that. And we have absolutely no evidence to suggest that if a man identifies a woman, he starts offending at female rates. Because I think it's important to say that these men don't have surgery. 80% of these men still have male bodies.
Is there any kind of compromise? Is there any way these two opinions are going to meet in the middle?
People can identify whatever way they wish. Masculinity should be able to embrace men who don't conform to a macho stereotype. That doesn't change your biological sex. Women are discriminated against because of their biological sex, and we can't erase that, because if we're erasing that, we're erasing women.
But we know that biological sex is not binary, and that's the fundamental point. The medical evidence, the scientific evidence...
Do you believe women can have penises?
Biological sense is not binary. We are
That's
talking,
your party's belief,
we are
isn't it?
talking about identity here, Joan. You know it's not that simple. You know this is...
Biological sex is binary, I'm afraid.
No, it's not.
Yes,
and there's no legal definition.
I don't know if we're going to reach any kind of compromise, but we will have to leave it there. But thank you both very much indeed for joining us this evening. Meghan Murphy, who we saw in Ewan's report, is a radical feminist who was invited to speak at Holyrood this week about her concerns for women's rights. The controversial Canadian writer spoke to us earlier. Meghan, so trans people have been able to self-identify in Canada since 2017. I mean, what difference has that change in the law actually made in society there? I mean, they were able to transition before, but it was a longer process.
Well, of course, it means that a male who identifies as transgender, who identifies as a trans woman or identifies literally as a woman, has the right to access women's spaces. So places like transition houses, he can be transferred to a female prison, he can use change rooms for women and girls, he can use the women's washroom, and so on and so forth.
But trans women have been able to access these spaces in the past, haven't they? So, I mean, so what's different now? What are your concerns?
Well, they haven't been able to access all of those spaces in the past. For example, places like transition houses and shelters for women would have not accepted men. And now, pretty much across the board in Canada, all of these spaces have caved to trans activism and caved to this pressure to allow men to access, with the exception actually of one transition house, which is Canada's longest standing transition house and rape crisis center, Vancouver Rape Relief, who has maintained a women-only policy and been really attacked as a result.
And I know that you have offended trans people in the past, and you were kicked off Twitter, weren't you? Because you don't want to use the terms that they want you to use. I mean, why do you feel that you can't do that? I mean, obviously it means a great deal to them. Do you think it's disrespectful that you won't do that? I mean, you've been talking about men there rather than trans women.
I think that, I mean, I don't want to lie, so I'm not going to say it's not possible to change sex. It's not possible for a male to become female. Physiologically, that's impossible. Even if you have surgery, even if you go on hormones, you can't turn a male body into a female body. So I don't want to go along with this because I don't want to, well, partly because I'm not going to be bullied into telling lies, but also I think it's sort of a form of gaslighting women. Like, I don't want women and girls to feel pressured to accept a naked man in their change room and to feel like, oh, I can't say anything, you know, I feel uncomfortable or I feel unsafe and I can't do anything because this man insists that he's a woman and I have to go along with this. Everyone else is going along with it. And I was kicked off Twitter for referring to a male as him. I didn't say anything offensive about this man. I wasn't, you know, harassing him. I just referred to him as him.
But if it means so much to trans people, why can't you just do that? Why can't you give them that respect, just in terms of being empathetic?
I don't think it's respectful to lie to people.
Being.
I don't think that's respectful. And I think trans-identified people are a tiny, tiny, tiny minority of the population, and women are half of the population. And I don't think it's respectful to force women to accept men as women, to accept men in these spaces where they feel vulnerable, just to placate the feelings of really a few people who are behaving in a really disrespectful and bullying way. I mean, trans activists are the ones who are harassing and threatening and bullying and threatening violence and sometimes perpetrating violence against women. And we're being accused of being disrespectful. Well,
I mean, trans groups, you know, do feel that what you say is very offensive and disrespectful, and they strongly believe that they can change not only their gender, but their sex.
Well, that's delusional. You know, like, you can't. No matter how many times you say trans women are women, trans women are not women. Trans women are males who identify as trans women or who would prefer to be women or feel they identify with femininity, and that's fine. I don't want to stop anyone from living their lives in, you know, a way that feels authentic and fulfilling. I want people to certainly push back against gender stereotypes and gender roles. If a man wants to wear a dress, that's great. I fully support that.
But do you not feel that you're attacking a vulnerable minority group?
I don't think it's an attack to tell the truth and to defend women's rights.
Why should protecting trans people's rights be detrimental to women's rights? Can they not kind of coexist?
Well, they can't coexist if it means that we have to give up our rights in spaces. I don't think it's necessary to pretend as though literally a person can change sex in order to protect people from discrimination and harassment.
OK, Meghan Murphy, thank you very much indeed for joining us on Scotland Tonight. In Ireland, trans people have been able to self-identify since 2015. Sarah Phillips is a trans woman and chairs Trans Equality Network Ireland. She spoke to us from Dublin. What difference did the introduction of being able to self-identify make to your life?
For me, Rona, the legislation meant that I was very much seen as an equal part of our society, an equal citizen of our country. From a practical level, it made it much easier for my paperwork to be accessed. In other words, I could get a passport much easier. I now had a birth certificate and a lot of other documentation, which previously had taken quite a long time and very an onerous process to achieve, was now a much simpler process to get.
And once you were legally able to call yourself a woman, I mean, how did that make you feel?
Well, I think I've always called myself a woman, Rona. I've always known this. I think from a legal perspective, it meant that my state and my country recognised that fact, and it made me feel really good. I think for all trans people here, for the ability to be able to self-identify their gender is crucial. It's about being able to be recognised for the person you are.
And have social attitudes changed, you think, in Ireland towards transgender people since this law was kind of reformed?
I think social attitude towards transgender people had changed quite a long time before this particular legislation came in. Trans people have been very visible over the last 15, 20 years in Irish society. And I think, you know, social attitudes are slightly different over here towards trans people than they are in your own jurisdiction. And I think it's very much spoken to the way the legislation eventually came to pass, because people were much more open to understanding trans issues and trans rights, and therefore it made it that much easier to bring in the legislation when it eventually came in.
I mean, there are concerns from some women in Scotland that the introduction of self-identification will threaten women's rights. What's your response to that?
I think our experience over here has been that, first of all, it hasn't threatened women's rights. In fact, it's enhanced women's rights because it has included trans women as well, and therefore has given them the protection that they needed. None of this legislation affects women's rights. Anywhere that people have spoken about these issues in the past, especially in the UK, most of those circumstances are actually legislated in other areas for, and therefore this legislation shouldn't affect those women's rights that they are speaking about. So our experience here has been very much that both their feminist community, our lesbian community, women generally have been very inclusive and been very, very respectful to this particular piece of legislation.
A feminist activist on our programme this evening, Meghan Murphy, and she's got concerns, and she says that there are places where women go specifically for protection from men, from male violence, and she believes that that is under threat.
I think for me, we must understand also that these sort of places, these spaces are very much places that trans women also seek out to be, safe from men specifically. The problem is that I think in those circumstances, there is also legislation in other areas that covers and protects women in those situations. You know, with all due respect, men, predatory men specifically, have always found ways of getting into these spaces without ever having to pretend to be trans. I think we are talking about looking to provide rights and security for both women and for trans people.
The debate about this has got quite heated, quite hostile at times, especially on social media. And there are some women that say if they question the proposed changes to the law or challenge it, they're called transphobic. I
think on both sides, on all sides, I think there's people possibly who haven't behaved appropriately in this debate. But I do think, you know, a trans community that has been very marginalised over many, many years, I think from that perspective, you've got to look at that you can understand the reaction that they may have when their very being is being attacked. I think, you know, we need to calm that conversation down, and I think we need to start to really get to the nub of what this piece of legislation is about, rather than all the heated debates and all the heated arguments that it's not about. And I think that is what's crucial. I think we were very lucky that we didn't need to have those debates, because those debates had happened quite, much earlier than before the legislation started getting brought through the houses of our Parliament. Sarah,
great to hear your thoughts on all this. Thanks for joining us on Scotland Tonight. Well, that's all from Scotland Tonight. There's no programme on Monday, but John will be here on Tuesday. Until then, Judith Carr, author of The Tiger Who Came to Tea and the Mog series, has died aged 95. Here's one last thing.
There was a big, furry, stripy tiger. The tiger said, "Excuse me, but I'm very hungry." He took all the sandwiches on the plate and swallowed them in one big mouthful. Out.